Urinary system, one of the coolest systems in the body. One of the things that you probably don't think about with the urinary system is regulation of blood volume. Remember when we were talking about blood pressure and we were talking about the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system? Remember, renin is made in the kidney. And so we're going to talk a lot about those same hormones. Do not get your ureters confused with your urethra. 2 ureters, 1 urethra. We already know that the kidney produces erythropoietin. Erythropoietin goes to the bone marrow and says, make more red cells. Renin activates the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. The kidneys, basically what they're trying to do is, the kidneys are trying to make sure the right amount of good stuff stays in the blood. Any excess stuff, any stuff that you don't need, goes into the urine. You pee it out. So if you take in a lot of potassium and you don't need the potassium, you pee that potassium out. The kidney is also involved in making sure that your vitamin D is in its active form. We know that we get vitamin D from the sun, right? But that's a whole process. It involves the skin, the liver, and the kidneys. Vitamin D is necessary for calcium absorption out of the small intestine. That's why when you buy calcium, it will say with vitamin D. The kidneys are involved with the lungs and all of those buffers we talked about to control body pH. So that's one of the last and most important things we're going to talk about this semester is acid-base balance. All right, and then of course what happens is when the blood is initially filtered by the kidney, some of the good stuff, glucose amino acids, they're small molecules. They will initially spill over into the kidney. But before that fluid becomes urine, that stuff is put back into the bloodstream. So we'll talk about that first. And then the kidney helps detoxify some things. The kidney can deaminate amino acids. Remember that some amino acids can be used in gluconeogenesis, can be used for energy production. And so the first step in that is taking off the amino acids, deaminating. All right, renal anatomy, you know where the kidneys are. The outside is the capsule. The next layer is the cortex. All of this stuff in here is the medulla. We're going to talk a lot about the nephron because that's where all the action happens. Now, this is a nephron. That's a nephron. So you got 2 kinds. You got long ones and short ones. We'll talk about the difference in a minute. Urine, what you see here is where blood vessels are going into this area. So the blood comes in and the blood goes out. If you have blood that ends up in your urine, that's bad. The materials are filtered out of the blood, but the blood itself, red blood cells, don't go into the urine unless the nephrons are damaged. Okay. So blood goes in, blood comes out, and then the fluid, basically the fluid that's initially removed from the bloodstream, goes through all of this stuff and eventually gets converted to urine. And so the urine moves from the nephron, which is this structure, into a collecting duct. So you have a whole bunch of nephrons that feed into the collecting duct. And the collecting ducts empty into the papillary duct, which is this little short part right here. So that's the nephron. There's the collecting duct. There's the papillary duct. This is the renal pyramid, and then that's the papilla. So each little renal pyramid has a little funnel that collects all of the urine from the papillary ducts. That's why it's called the papillary ducts, because they're in the renal papilla. That's called the minor calyx. So each one of these little things is a minor calyx. The minor calyces, that's plural calyx, merge to form a major calyx, and the major calyces merge to form the renal pelvis. The renal vasculature. Blood comes in through the renal artery. The renal artery divides into the segmental arteries. There's a segmental artery there, there's a segmental artery there. The segmental arteries divide to form the interlobar. Now be careful. Each one of these things, each one of these red things is an interlobar artery. The interlobar arteries split and they arch over the tops of the pyramids to form the arcuate. They arc. The arcuate arteries. And then branching off of the arcuate arteries are the interlobular. Renal artery, segmental artery, interlobar artery, arcuate artery, interlobular or artery. Now, if we blow this part up, okay. All right, this red one here, this would be the what? Interlobar, because it's going to be between the pyramids. Interlobar. This would be the arcuate. This would be the interlobular. Right?
Or cortical radiator.
Yeah. Okay? I just want to make sure you hadn't gotten lost.
Those little tiny things in the neck.
Well, they're the glomeruli of the neck. Yeah. Okay. All right. Now, if we take this and blow it up, all right, this is still the interlobular
Why did
artery.
you just blow up?
That part right there.
Like goes up and down the purple thing?
This whole section. Okay. So that would still be the arcuate. This would be the interlobular. All right. Okay. This is the afferent arteriole. Afferent going into. That's the glomerulus. The blood comes out of the glomerulus via the efferent arteriole. And notice that the afferent is bigger than the efferent.
Because it loses stuff.
But no, because it increases the pressure. We'll talk about it later. From the efferent arteriole, it goes into these peritubular capillaries. Basically, these capillaries are surrounding the tubules of the nephron. From the peritubular capillaries, it goes into the peritubular venules. And then we get to go backwards. From the peritubular venules, it goes into the interlobular veins, then to the arcuate veins, then to the interlobar veins. And then your book probably leaves out segmental veins, but I put it in there because it's always in the picture. And then to the renal vein. Okay. Now, the sympathetic autonomic nervous system controls the production of urine because it's basically adjusting the flow of blood to the kidney. If your blood pressure drops, that's one of the things that the sympathetic autonomic nervous system can detect. Will stimulate renin. Renin starts the activation of angiotensin. Angiotensin 2, remember, causes vasoconstriction. Stimulates the release of antidiuretic hormone, which makes you reabsorb water. Stimulates the release of aldosterone, which makes you reabsorb sodium so that it's easier to reabsorb the water. And makes you thirsty. So those four things increase blood flow and blood pressure, blood volume and blood pressure. Once the urine is formed, then it drains through the ureters down to the bladder. And even if you're standing on your head, peristalsis will still squeeze the urine down into the bladder. This is a cross-section of a ureter. And the ureters, the urinary bladder, and the urethra are lined with transitional epithelium. Remember that this stuff, is kind of rounded up when there's no fluid in the organ, and then as the fluid increases and the walls begin to stretch, then these cells can flatten out. So ureters, urinary bladder, and urethra lined with transitional epithelium. Now, the male bladder is here, the female bladder is here, and yes, the male bladder is bigger than the female bladder because they don't have a uterus sitting on top of it. There's just more room. Now, the urinary bladder is a muscular organ. This muscle is called the detrusor muscle. That's the muscle that's in the wall of the bladder. You have rugae in this as well, just like you have in the stomach. The vagina has rugae, again, allows for expansion. There's the transitional epithelium. Rounded when the bladder is empty. As the bladder fills, this stretches and the stuff begins to flatten. The ureteral openings, that's not an easy word to say. Ureteral, the openings from the ureters. The ureters don't hit right here on top of the bladder. They're actually down on the back side toward the bottom. And so as urine fills up, it helps to close these so the urine doesn't normally back up into the ureters. Urine comes out, not that. Between the ureteral openings and the internal urethral orifice, it's called the trigone. And it's just basically, it's an area that just kind of funnels the urine into the urethra. When the bladder begins to fill, pressure receptors detect the pressure. They send a signal back for this muscle, for the detrusor muscle to contract, and of course that also puts additional pressure to force the urine out of the urethra. This, the actual process of urination, is controlled by the parasympathetic. So, urine formation at the kidney is controlled by sympathetic. Urination is stimulated by the parasympathetic. Right where the urethra joins on the bladder, there's a little circular section of smooth muscle here called the internal urethral sphincter. In males, it's right above the prostate. In females, it's right here. There is no prostate. All right, the external urethral sphincter, like your external anal sphincter, is skeletal muscle. This is voluntary. This is innervated by a nerve called the pudendal nerve. In women, it's basically a little circular piece of muscle right at the pelvic floor. In men, it's right below the prostate. From the side, here's the bladder, here's the prostate. This is where the external would be. In women, the internal is going to be right here, the external is going to be right here, which is basically when you kegel, you contract those pelvic floor muscles, you're contracting the external urethral sphincter. The male urethra, of course, starts with the bladder, passes through the prostate and out the penis. So the male urethra, I'll get it out in a minute, is 7 to 8 inches long. Ladies, not as long, 1.5 inches long. All right, now in the female, of course, the only thing the urethra does is transport urine to the outside of the body. In men, of course, there's two functions. The urethra is going to carry urine, and it's also going to carry semen. In males, the urogenital system basically is all one connection. The testes and the vas deferens, what do they call it? The ductus deferens, I always learned it as the vas deferens, come in and merges here, and then that merges with the urethra here at the prostate. During ejaculation, the internal urethral sphincter contracts. The urine would kill the sperm. The male urethra has the part through the prostate called the prostatic urethra. It has a little short area that goes through that, that's basically surrounded by the external urethral sphincter. That's the membranous urethra. And then the part that's actually in the shaft of the penis is the spongy or penile urethra. The micturition reflex. As the bladder begins to fill with urine, stretch receptors detect that pressure that builds up, and that sends a signal two places. You have a short reflex that sends a signal right back to the detrusor muscle itself to contract, and then you have a longer reflex that goes up and lets your cerebral cortex know you're about to pee on yourself. Just like with the anal sphincter, you have to, of course, learn to control the external urethral sphincter. If you keep the external urethral sphincter closed, so does the internal urethral sphincter. Now, this is a little bit different than the anal sphincter. Remember that the anal sphincter, the internal sphincter relaxes, and then all you've got is the external. Now, of course, up to a point, if you get more than about a half a liter of fluid in your bladder, you're going to pee on yourself anyways.